As a child, I recall making repeated attempts to read the Bible all the way through. When I was in 5th grade, I received the Student Bible, and I opened those fresh pages with this ambitious hope that I could read it from start to finish. Genesis? No problem. Those familiar stories of Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, those were easy to engage in. Exodus? What an exciting story. I mean, you've got Moses leading the people out of Egypt. Then you get to Leviticus. Well, we'll just say that my excitement started to wane. Numbers and Deuteronomy, well, it fizzled altogether, and I couldn't carry on. Playing my Game Boy seemed much more interesting. After repeated attempts, I wasn't able to do it until much later as an adult in seminary. It's true, the Old Testament is not that exciting all of the time. It can be hard to engage in, it is long, it is complicated. It's not exactly a page turner. I wouldn't bring it with me to the beach on vacation. But we can't use that as an excuse to just dismiss the Old Testament altogether. We can't skip through those many pages and just jump ahead to the New Testament, the part that we know a little bit better. Because if we want to understand the story of Jesus, if we want to understand why God chooses to come and be with us, we have to understand that backstory. We have to consider those centuries upon centuries of events that led to the incarnation in Christ. So for the next few weeks, we are going to journey our way through just a bit of the Old Testament. The session of this church has graciously invited me to preach for a few weeks. I get to be with you through the end of December. And during this time, I've decided to use the narrative lectionary, which is very different than the lectionary that we're used to. It starts in the Old Testament, and it works its way through, touching on the highlights, giving the broader story. And then come Advent and Christmas, we jump into the New Testament. We hear the story of Jesus. This helps understand the bigger picture, broader story. So to get us started this week, we're actually jumping in pretty far into the Old Testament. This is way beyond the point of anywhere that I read as a kid. Nestled in the books of prophets is this short book of Amos. Now Amos marks a major turning point in the Old Testament. He is the first one to call out Israel for their behavior and tell them they're going to be destroyed as a result of their behavior. No, you didn't misunderstand that. You didn't mishear me. Yes, Amos says he's going to destroy all of the people. God is so angry. This sounds a lot like the actions God took back in the time of Noah, when humanity failed miserably and God called for an epic redo. This same level of intensity and anger when God destroyed the earth, this is what's expressed in Amos. To call Amos a Debbie Downer is a misunderstanding. It is a big understatement. He describes God as this warrior, this fierce and angry God. Now this is sort of the stereotypical image of God. When we think about the Old Testament, oftentimes people think, oh, God is just really angry in all of those books. We don't get to hear any of God's goodness or God's faithfulness. We're going to hear more of that in the coming weeks. Don't worry, it's not all grim like it is today. When we get to Isaiah, we get to hear more of that hopeful message. Well, it's not surprising that Amos was rarely quoted in Christian commentaries. Nobody really talked about this book for quite some time because there doesn't seem to be much hope in this text. I once heard someone say that if you like the prophet Amos, you probably don't understand him. The words of Amos are harsh, to say the least. Now, we don't know much about the prophet himself. We know he was some sort of shepherd, that he was from the southern kingdom. He was sent to the north to prophesy. His words come in a time of relative peace. Things are okay as he is speaking. So it's no surprise that the people were a bit taken aback by his words. I can imagine them responding to Amos with skepticism. God is angry at us, they might say. Then how do you explain all of this peace and prosperity that we're experiencing? It seems to us God thinks we're doing all right. But Amos sees no future for Israel. According to him, they are at the point of no return. He calls them out for their worship, stating that God is appalled by it. He doesn't mince words as he speaks. He says, God says, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. It's pretty clear God is angry. But it's important to note that Amos isn't talking about the worship itself. The prayers and the liturgy, those were probably just fine. I don't think God really cared what style of worship they had. The concern here is about the worshipers themselves, because their lives did not reflect what they were doing in worship. Amos is calling them hypocrites, telling them that they are saying and doing one thing in worship and something completely different the other 6 days of the week. The people of God, who were themselves once oppressed in Egypt, have now become oppressors of others. Amos calls them out for their greed, for letting others live in poverty and taking advantage of them. He calls them out for their militaristic society, for advancing their own good in other territories at the expense of others. There's this small group of people in this community that holds most of the wealth. And so this elite, small group of people have the power. Amos sees how these wealthy folks are taking advantage of that power to gain even more for themselves. And so the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. If I didn't know any better, I might think Amos was talking about our world today. We too live in a time where there is a major gap between the wealthy and the poor. In our nation, the top 1% of the wealthiest of people hold 20% or more of the wealth. That's 1/5. CEOs continue to give themselves massive bonuses each year, while the working class struggle paycheck to paycheck. Good health care is available if you can afford it. Cuts to Medicare and other programs are making that more difficult these days. Public schools in wealthy neighborhoods have got it good, but those in those poorer neighborhoods struggle to keep their buildings maintained and their classrooms equipped. There's an affordable housing crisis right here in Austin. Those who have lived here for generations are being pushed out because the cost of living is just too high. Gun violence has a clear correlation to poverty. It's estimated that on average 7 children die each day from gun violence in this country, and most of them live in poor communities. Other tragedies of gun violence, like the one in Sutherland Springs last week, could have been prevented if those with a history of violence were not allowed to buy assault rifles. But in our nation, things fall through the cracks. There are loopholes. Reasonable gun reform has not yet happened because those who write the laws are the ones with the wealth and the power, and they try to keep that for themselves, advancing their own good at the expense of everyone else. The prophet prophet Amos would be appalled by the state of the world, not just in our own country. Those were a few things that I listed, but beyond our borders where poverty and hunger are even greater. No doubt he would have harsh words for us, the wealthiest nation in the world. And he would have harsh words for us in the church. Amos would call us out for praying for peace, but not working for peace. Amos would call us out for eating the meal at communion, but not feeding our hungry neighbors. Amos would call us out for claiming that we value justice and righteousness, but fail to live into those values the other 6 days of the week. Amos would be critical of us, pointing out the ways that our lives in worship, what we do here on Sunday morning, is not always carried out the other days of the week. That we aren't living those lives of justice and righteousness that he calls us to. That we aren't helping the disadvantaged and advocating for them. Genuinely loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. I have to wonder if Amos would have any hope for us. There doesn't seem to be much hope in this text, after all. He sure didn't have hope for the people of Israel. He was convinced they were done. But as we look at this text, if we look a little bit closer at this message of despair and impending destruction, we do see glimmers of hope. For one, God does not destroy the people of Israel, as Amos was convinced that he would do. God held that covenant sealed in the rainbow after the flood, promising never to do that again. Now, a few decades later, the northern kingdom did fall apart. The people were scattered and scrambled, but God didn't just sweep in and destroy them. God did not give up on them completely. And we see another glimmer of hope in this text, as Amos reveals what is important to God. God has a heart for justice and righteousness. This is good news for those who are poor, for those who are sick and can't afford their medication. Good news for those children who attend substandard schools, for those who have to relocate because the rent is too high. Good news for those who fall victim to gun violence. The good news is that this God is not this angry God portrayed in the Old Testament. God is good and God is faithful because God desires justice and righteousness. God deeply desires the best for all people. The imagery that Amos uses is telling. He declares, "Let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." The word that he uses here for water is very intentional. It's the same word that was used way back in Genesis. The same word for water used to describe those primordial waters of creation. The ones that were there before God started the work of creation. Amos is telling us that God's desire for justice and righteousness stem back from the very beginning. That it is foundational to who God is and what God desires for us. And so as we carry these words from Amos, these harsh words, let us be reminded that it is God's fervent hope that we be restored to that original plan, that original hope for us, that justice and righteousness might be prevalent in all that we do, that all people may be restored and made whole to that original intent. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his I Have a Dream speech, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." God continues to be faithful as we journey ahead, inviting us into that work of justice and righteousness, and God will prevail. Thanks be to God.